everyone. My name is Stephen Mosier. I'm the president of an organization called the Population Research Institute, and I claim to be an expert on China. Now, the two things you have to know about China going in are China is big and China is old. It's one of the largest countries on the planet. It used to be number one in population, but has recently been overtaken by India now. So China is at almost 1.4 billion people. That's 1,400 million people, is the second most populous country on the planet. And of course, it's very old. It has a history stretching back about 3,000 years. The interesting thing about the government of China is that many of the governing principles that are used today by the Chinese Communist Party, which is in charge of China and has been since the Communist Revolution in 1949, many of the governing principles of the Chinese Communist Party actually were developed in China over 2,000 years ago. So if we're thinking about communism, we think about Karl Marx, we think about Friedrich Engels back in the 1850s and 60s and 70s. We think about Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who led the disastrous, bloody communist revolution in Russia in the 19-teens and led the country in the early 20s until his death. So we think about communism as being an invention of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. But actually, a form of communism, interestingly enough, was invented in China over 2,000 years ago. Because over 2,000 years ago, at the time of the first dynasty of China, called the Qin dynasty, Qin is where we get the word China, by the way. That's why we call it China, because the first dynasty that unified all the country was called the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty had a lot of things that we associate with modern Marxist-Leninism. They had a huge standing army of up to 1 million men. They had political commissars in the army. That is to say, they had political appointees in every battalion, in every division, in every part of the army of ancient China to look over the shoulders of the generals and to make sure they weren't conspiring against the emperor. So political commissars in the military. They also had, in ancient China, they had concentration camps. Concentration camps in ancient China were used to build the Great Wall. You've all heard about the Great Wall, the largest human construction in human history. It's the only human construct that can actually be seen from space, from the International Space Station. The other thing that ancient China had was the Chinese government under the Qin dynasty and later dynasties actually controlled a large part of the economy. It controlled the production of salt, which is vital for your diet. You can't live without salt. They also controlled the production of iron, which, if you think back over 2,000 years ago, what did you need iron for? Well, you needed it to make farm implements on the one hand, so you could plow and plant and harvest crops, but you also needed it to make weapons, to make swords and shields. So the control of iron was like an early form of gun control for the Chinese dynasties. The emperor of China was almost a godlike figure, very close to the way the Chinese Communist Party today regards its leader, Xi Jinping. Just as communist leader of China, Xi Jinping, has books printed about him, has his picture in everyone's home, has his picture posted, even in Christian churches in China, you're required to put up a picture of the supreme leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping. The ancient emperor 2,000 years ago was celebrated in the same way. He had statues all over the country. He had propaganda troops, song and dance troops going around the country over 2,000 years ago, singing his praises telling the Chinese people of ancient China how wonderful their emperor was and how magnificent and powerful he was. In the same way that you see propaganda on Chinese communist television today in China, where the newspapers print the picture and the sayings of communist leader Xi Jinping. And as I mentioned, his posters and pictures are everywhere. So a lot of the way that China is governed has to do with the way China has been governed throughout its history, from the Qin dynasty to the later dynasties, the Tang dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Ming dynasty, and then the Qing dynasty, which ended in 1911 with a Republican revolution. Very interesting part of Chinese history, because once the last emperor, who was a 5-year-old boy by the name of Pu Yi, once he was overthrown in 1911, there was actually a Republican form of government set up. And it was supposed to be a democracy under a man by the name of Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of modern China. Sun Yat-sen actually spent many, many years in Hawaii, one of our 50 states. There he became a Christian. There he studied the founding documents of the United States. He studied the Constitution. He studied the Bill of Rights. He studied our Republican form of government with separation of powers between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And he took that back to China. And so the Republic of China was, throughout the teens and the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, a Republican government with a democratically elected assembly. The problem was, at the same time that the Republican government was trying to get set up in China to govern the country under democratic principles, two things happened, which were very bad for China. The first thing that happened was a communist party was organized in 1921, and Chairman Mao, a man named Mao Zedong, who was a person who described himself as being without law and without God, he described himself that way on many occasions, was to take power in China, at least to try to take power in China in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, until he ultimately succeeded in 1949. So that at the same time that Sun Yat-sen and his follower Chiang Kai-shek were trying to set up a Republic of China, the Communist Party was trying to set up what they call the People's Republic of China. So there was an ongoing civil war in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And to make matters worse, the Japanese invaded China in 1938. And so the Republic of China, under then leader Chiang Kai-shek, was having to fight a two-front war. First, he was having to fight the foreign invaders, the Japanese imperialists, who had taken over the northern part of the country, Manchuria, and then invaded and took the major coastal cities, places like Shanghai and Guangzhou. And then, of course, at the same time, he was having to fight the communist insurrection, the Red Army, which was spreading throughout the interior of China. And ultimately, the Republic of China lost that battle, but they only lost it not because the Chinese people didn't want democracy, not because the Chinese people didn't want respect for human rights and religious freedom and all of the freedoms that we take for granted here in the United States, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest, all of those freedoms that we cherish. The Chinese people wanted that, but the Republic of China was simply overwhelmed by the combination of the Japanese invasion and having to fight the Red Army, the Communist Army at the same time, especially because the Communist Army was getting huge support from the communist superpower of the day, which was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was pouring in arms and men into the civil war in China. It sent 200,000 Koreans into that war. It sent the several hundred thousand soldiers from the north of China to fight on the side of the Red Army. And so at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party took power in 1949. And one way to look at the history of the last 73 years now, 74 years of communist rule in China, is to look at the different campaigns that the Chinese Communist Party has carried out in China against one group or another. And when I say campaign, I mean a political movement that is all-encompassing, that mobilizes the entire population of the country to target one specific group. Now, in the 1950s, there were lots of those political campaigns because the Chinese Communist Party under Chairman Mao wanted to eliminate the bad classes, what they called the bad classes. Marxism, of course, is all about classes, right? The good classes, the bad classes. What in China are called the red classes, the good communist classes, and the black classes, the classes that you want to eliminate. And one of the classes that they wanted to eliminate were anyone who ran a business. They called those people capitalists. And there was a huge campaign to purge capitalists in China. And millions were arrested and tortured, and many were killed. And there was another campaign to eliminate what were called landlords. Now, you might think that if you hear the term landlord, you think of one of the huge estates in England under the dukes or the barons or the earls or something like that. But these landlords and also the rich peasants, they were another one of the bad classes, so called by the Chinese Communist Party. They were people who owned just a little more land than they could farm themselves. And so they would rent out part of the land to other farmers to take care of it because they and their own sons didn't have enough labor to do it. So just because they were a little bit ahead of the game, just because they'd worked hard for a generation or two, just because they'd accumulated a little more land than the other people in the village, they were targeted by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the promise of the Chinese Communist Party to China's hundreds of millions of villagers, the people we also call peasants, who lived off the land, was this: if you support us in taking power, we will carry out a land reform and you will all get free land. Now, remember, Chinese communist parties, of course, promise free everything, right? That's what they're known for. Free housing, free food, free land, whatever you need will be provided for by the government. And you won't have a care in the world. So that was the promise made to China's hundreds of millions of villagers. And so the land reform, so-called, was carried out in each of China's 2 million villagers. A group of Red Army activists would come in, communist activists would come into a village. They would organize the poor peasants, and they would target the rich peasants who would be identified, called out by name, put up on a stage, beaten up. Sometimes they would then be executed, and their land would then be taken from them and divided among the people. Millions upon millions of landlords and rich peasants in China were killed in that fashion. We're talking over 10 million, so we're talking huge numbers of deaths here, to carry out what was called a land reform so that everyone could have their own land, except it didn't stay in their own hands, because as happened in the Soviet Union, once the land reform had been completed in China, the Chinese Communist Party then changed its tune. It said, we're going to move now to collective farming. And first they would organize a neighborhood and tell the 50 or so families in the neighborhood, you're now going to farm your land in common. And then they moved from that to a larger order, higher order collective with hundreds of families farming the land in common. And then they moved to something in 1957, 1958 called the People's Communes. And these people's communes were huge. They were 20,000 people, 50,000 people, 80,000 people, all farming the land in common. I was the first American researcher allowed to live in China in 1979, 1980. That was the first year that the United States and China had diplomatic relations. And I was picked by the US State Department and by the Committee on Scholarly Exchange with China to be the first social scientist to go to China and live among the Chinese people and find out what life had been like after 30 years of communist rule. Remember, they'd taken power in 1949. I was there 30 years later in 1979. So I was able to talk to people about the so-called people's communes that they were still living in at the time. The people's communes, where everyone farmed the land in common, were not actually run by farmers who knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to weed, when to fertilize. They were run instead of being run by agricultural experts, they were run by Communist Party leaders, many of whom knew nothing whatsoever about farming, but they were very, very good about following political orders. And the orders that came down were nonsensical. They really, literally made no sense. At one point, Chairman Mao, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, ordered that all the birds in China be killed because he said the sparrows were eating grain. So the people in the Chinese communes went out and they killed all the birds. And then what happened? Because there were no birds eating insects, the insect population grew huge overnight, and the insects ate more grain than the birds ever would have. The other thing Chairman Mao did in 1958 and 59 was he told everyone that they should make their own steel mills. So every commune in the country built backyard steel smelters and threw in their cooking pots and anything iron they could get their hands on in order to try to smelt it into steel. They were cutting down their trees. They were burning everything out of wood to try to smelt the steel. Meanwhile, the crops were rotting in the fields because no one was paying attention to agricultural production. So because of this series of missteps, because of this series of mistakes, there was a famine in China. Now, in the people's communes in 1958, the Communist Party had promised that everyone was going to be able to eat for free. You don't need to cook food in your own kitchen anymore. You don't need a cooking pot. All you have to do is you have to come to the commune cafeteria and you can eat all the rice you want. You can eat your fill every day of the year. Well, that lasted about 6 months, and then the food ran out. A famine set in, the worst famine in human history. And we think, and this is a huge number to wrap your mind around, we think that 45 or 50 million people died in that famine in China from 1960 to 1962. 50 million people is a larger number than the population of many countries. There are entire villages in China that every living soul died because they had no food. They all starved to death. In the village I was living in, several hundred people died, mostly the very young and the very elderly died in the worst famine in human history. And this was a man-made famine. If you had simply left the Chinese people alone, If you had simply given them land and said, farm the land yourselves, feed your families, everyone would have been fine. There would not have been mass starvation, mass famine. But that's not what happened. The Chinese Communist Party, in its misplaced idealism, decided that it was going to force everyone to farm the land in communes. That's what communism is all about. And the result in China, and again around the world, has been absolute disaster. After the Cultural Revolution, of course, you had, after the Great Leap Forward, which I was just talking about, with the commune system and the massive famine, there was the Cultural Revolution in China, another massive political campaign in which millions and millions of people died. The so-called 5 bad classes were once again targeted. And it wasn't just the people who had been landlords or the people who had been store owners who were targeted. It was their sons and daughters and their grandsons and granddaughters. Because if your ancestor, if your grandfather had been a landlord or a rich peasant, his sins, so-called, were passed along to you. If your grandfather or grandmother had been a store owner, her sins or his sins were passed along to you, because the sins, so-called, of the grandparents and parents were passed along to the children. Very, very unfair, very inequitable. And just one more massive political campaign that claimed millions of victims. And yet, as bad as the famine after the Great Leap Forward was, claiming 45 million, 50 million victims, as bad as the Cultural Revolution was, which ran from 1966 to the death of Mao in 1976, I'm about to tell you about an even worse political campaign, a political campaign that began when I was in China. And this political campaign came to be known as the one-child policy, because the Chinese Communist Party decided in 1979 and 1980 that there were too many people in China. Now, I have to say here that having lived in Asia for 10 years and being someone who can read, write, and speak Chinese, and being someone who spent years interviewing people in China, in the cities and in the countryside, I can tell you that China's main problem is not too many people. Its main problem is the 96 million members of the Chinese Communist Party who are constantly interfering in the efforts of the Chinese people to improve their own lives and to live free of government surveillance and government control. Because every time the Chinese Communist Party has launched a political campaign, millions, tens of millions have suffered, and many, many people have died. The one-child policy was launched because the Chinese Communist Party was having trouble feeding and housing the Chinese people. Of course, if you left the Chinese people alone with their enterprising spirit, with their very, very strong work ethic, they would have fed and clothed and housed themselves quite handily. But the Chinese Communist Party wasn't willing to let well enough alone. It wanted to run everyone's lives all the time. And so it decided, in its wisdom, that everyone should limit themselves to one child. Now, there were a lot of people in China in 1980 who didn't want to limit themselves to one child. They wanted to have a second child. They wanted to have a third child or a fourth child. They wanted to be free to exercise their right as couples, husband and wife, to decide for themselves how many children they should have. But the Communist Party decided that it was going to take that right the right to procreate, the right to conceive, the right to bear children away from couples and set up a state plan. And so the Chinese Communist Party decreed that only a certain number of babies could be born in China each year, and that you had to have a quota from the government. You had to have a permission slip from the government before you could actually conceive a child. Now, in my village, we had a lot of women in 1980 who were pregnant. And they were happy to be pregnant. They were 3 months pregnant. They were 6 months pregnant. Some of them were very, very close to giving birth. And then the one-child policy began. And local officials came and told them that if they were pregnant with a second child, if they were pregnant with a third, they had to end their pregnancy. They had to get an abortion. So it was forced abortion, forced sterilization as a result of the one-child policy. I was there. I saw these women crying, very sad by the fact that they were being forced to give up children that they had been anticipating, holding in their arms in a few months, to this new state-run political campaign. The one-child policy continued until 2016. So it ran from 1980, when I was first in China, I've been back many times, until 2016. It ran for 36 years. For 36 years, the Chinese people in the cities were told that they could only have one child. And for the most part, in the countryside, there were strict limits on childbearing as well. I interviewed a senior official from China a few years ago, and I asked him, how many children were not born because of the one-child policy? How many abortions have you carried out to enforce the one-child policy? And he told me that the one-child policy had been responsible for eliminating, that was his word, eliminating 400 million people from China's population. 400 million is a population larger than the population of the United States by several tens of millions. And if you think back to the political campaigns that I talked about in the 50s, the Great Leap Forward with 45 million famine victims, the Cultural Revolution with its millions and millions of victims and deaths, the other campaigns that have been carried out throughout Chinese history, plus the 400 million unborn and newborn children killed in the one-child policy. I conclude that the Chinese Communist Party is, quite frankly, the biggest killing machine in human history. It's responsible for more deaths of more human beings than any other political organization in history. We know that communism, whether we're talking about communism in North Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, whether we're talking about communism in the Soviet Union or the former Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary, we know that communism has claimed an enormous number of victims because the Communist Party always has to have an enemy. The Communist Party, which promises to create heaven on earth, is always just one execution away from paradise, one execution away from creating paradise on earth, or so they tell us. But in no country in the world, throughout the long history of communism, has any Communist Party killed as many people as the Chinese Communist Party has killed. I could talk about the other political campaigns that are going on today, the campaign against religious faith, where Catholics and Christians and Buddhists and Taoists and Tibetan Buddhists and Muslims in the far West all religions are under attack in China, because the Chinese Communist Party, quite frankly, wants to be the only faith in China. Communism, in a sense, of course, is very, has very many resemblances to a religion. It has a catechism in Karl Marx's writings and the writings of Lenin, and in China, the writings of Mao Zedong. It has an organization. The members of the Chinese Communist Party are kind of like the acolytes in the Church of China, and the head of the Chinese Communist Party is a kind of semi-deity. At least he is the subject of a huge personality cult in China, where people bow and scrape before his statues. They sing praises of songs of praise of him at their meetings, and they are required to read his writings virtually every day. That's one political campaign that's being carried out in China at the present day that is claiming its share of victims. China has made enormous progress economically over the last 30 years. But I think we all need to be clear about one thing. That progress has occurred not because of the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, but literally in spite of the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, its 96 million members, receive their salaries from the government, that is, from the taxes paid by ordinary Chinese. When they hold their banquets, which they do frequently, they eat at the expense of ordinary Chinese people. When they go on their retreats, when they go on their junkets, when they go to their resorts, when they hold their meetings, when they sit in their high-rise Communist Party office buildings, all of that is paid for by ordinary Chinese people through their taxes. So the Chinese Communist Party is actually, looking at it from that point of view, a kind of parasitical organization, a blood-sucking organization, if you will, that is feasting on the populace of China. Without the Chinese Communist Party taking away 1/6 or 1/5, or maybe as much as 1/3 of the wealth of China each year, China would have developed even faster and even farther than it has to the present day. You can see the difference if you compare China and Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is just a relatively small island sitting 100 miles off the coast of South China. But it is occupied by 24 million Taiwanese, most of whom came from mainland China over the last few hundred years. And it has a much wealthier, much healthier, and much better educated population than mainland China does. Why? Because it is a free market democracy. The people on Taiwan are free to start businesses and buy and sell goods without government interference. The people on Taiwan hold free elections where they democratically choose their president and their representatives in the legislature. So they enjoy the freedoms on Taiwan that the people on mainland China are denied by the Chinese Communist Party. And the result is not just a happier and healthier population on Taiwan, but also a much wealthier population on Taiwan, because the per capita income, the amount of money that the average person makes in Taiwan, is several times that the average person makes in China itself. So there you have a perfect a controlled experiment between a free country and a communist country. And you can see in the outcome the advantages of economic and political freedom. So I'd like to invite any of you watching who may have questions to join the chat right now and send them to me. We've got a few minutes left in this presentation that I can try to answer them in. I do have one question from Jashin, who says that I live in Massachusetts and I'm an aspiring marine biologist. I smiled because I was, I suppose I still am a marine biologist. I went to the University of Washington in Seattle, which has a wonderful marine biology program. Of course, in Massachusetts, you also have a wonderful marine biology research institute in Woods Hole, which when you graduate from high school and go to college, you might consider attending. I was fascinated by marine biology until I went to Japan and Hong Kong and China, and then I became fascinated in turn with China. And I spent the last 40 years studying China and not whales and marine biology, but that's a great field as well. So I normally get questions like, what does China's future hold? And the answer is, it is difficult to say. I would like to say that the Chinese people will one day come to enjoy the same economic and political freedom that we do here in the United States, and that their compatriots do in the island nation of Taiwan. I cannot be too optimistic in that regard because the controls that the Chinese Communist Party has placed on the Chinese people are tightening. Everybody in China now, for the most part, has a smartphone, and the Chinese Communist Party tracks in real time everyone's whereabouts. So if you have your phone with you in China, the government knows exactly who you are and where you are, and can make a pretty good guess as to what you're doing by just tracking you on your phone. They also have fairly advanced artificial intelligence to help with the tracking of over 1 billion people. So, for example, if you're in the capital city of Beijing, China, and you jaywalk in the city, walk across a road between the streetlights outside of the crosswalk, the surveillance camera will pick up your crime. The artificial intelligence and face recognition technology will identify you, and the fine for jaywalking, get this, the fine for jaywalking will be automatically deducted from your bank account. No human intervention needed. Those are the kinds of controls we're talking about in China. We also had, of course, a COVID pandemic over the last 3 years, which began in China at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I am absolutely certain, because of my background in biology that I mentioned, and because of my background in China, that the virus did come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. All roads lead to the Wuhan lab, and that it spread in China first and then was spread deliberately by the Chinese Communist Party throughout the world. I don't think there's any secret about that. But I would say about controls that China locked down longer and harder than any other country in the world. They locked down in January and February and March of 2020. They locked down 60 million people in the city of Wuhan and the surrounding province of Hubei. You couldn't leave your apartment for weeks and weeks on end. And then just last year, when they had another breakout in Shanghai, they locked people in their apartments for several months. That was, sadly, for some people, a death sentence. These lockdowns, the idea for which came from China, were sadly emulated by many countries, including many states in the United States. So the lesson, I think, of that experience was that we should not be following the Chinese Communist Party's practices when it comes to epidemics, when it comes to respect for human rights, when it comes to democracy or economic freedom. And because the Chinese Communist Party represents the polar opposite of all of these things that we value. So I appreciate your time today, and I hope you've learned something about the People's Republic of China, and that you will keep the Chinese people in your thoughts in the months and years to come. Thank you all very much. This is Steve Mosier with the Population Research Institute, signing off.